Okay, so now that we've discussed sort of the physician firm as the supply of medical care, now we're going to think about the other major component of the health system, and that's hospitals, right? Hospitals providing or supplying medical care, and there's going to be quite a few differences here. Okay, so your learning objectives for this chapter. First of all, you need to be able to grasp the nature of the typical hospital, where most of the activity is actually directed by someone who's not technically employed by the hospital. And that's the private doctor. So this is a really bizarre sort of organization for I don't want to call it a business, but something that's similar to a business, right? You also want to be able to follow the discussion about who owns the hospital and its consequences. So is it doctors that own the hospital? Is it administrators? And what are the consequences of those potentially different owners? You also want to be able to think about the importance of the governing board, which is called the Board of Trustees, and understand sort of the political nature of the governance of a hospital, and apply this understanding to the approach looking at hospital behavior. Obviously, since we're talking about the hospital kind of as like a business almost, you want to be able to also understand the nature of the costs of operating a hospital, right? And how the world of hospitals has changed over recent decades, how it has evolved in recent decades. You also want to understand how ownership matters, particularly the for-profit model versus the not-for-profit model. And lastly, you should be able to come to an understanding of the difference between market level demand for a hospital versus the demand curve facing a single hospital. So that's not anything new. We did that last time, right, with physicians. Okay, so as an introduction here, hospitals basically are the center of modern medicine, right? This is where modern medicine revolves around, is hospitals. And anyone that becomes seriously ill is almost certainly going to find themselves in a hospital, right? At some point in their lives. So I've been in a hospital before. I had a hernia when I was 5. I had to have surgery. I think that's the only time I've been an inpatient. I can't think of any others. But most people will visit the hospital at least once in their lives. And on top of that, 3 out of every $8 spent on healthcare in the United States is spent on hospital care. So a pretty substantial portion. Now, the interesting thing about hospitals is the person that is directing all of the activity in the hospital isn't even an employee of the hospital. So this is really unique to the organization of hospitals. These doctors who are admitting patients to the hospital are neither an employee nor are they under the direct control of the hospital or even the supervision of the hospital. So this is really bizarre. And it leads to some interesting consequences. So in this chapter, we're looking at the organization of the hospital, looking at the various forms of ownership, whether it's not for profit, for profit, or the third alternative, which is a government-owned hospital like the Veterans Affairs Hospital, as well as the effects of the different types of ownership on behavior. Okay, so we're going to start by just thinking about the organization of the hospital, and that's what I don't know what happened to my title up there, but that's basically what this first section is the organization of the hospital, right? The hospital organization. So we're going to focus first on the typical organization of a hospital, which is the not-for-profit model. Okay, so most hospitals are not for profit, which is slightly different than nonprofit. there's it's kind of a blurred line, but slight difference than nonprofit, not for profit. So we want to think about what it is and what it is not. And that kind of goes along with what they can do and what they can't do. So for the most part, they may not, cannot, and do not distribute profits like in a standard for-profit organization. Okay, so not-for-profit hospitals don't have shareholders, which are also called residual claimants. And so any profits have to be distributed to someone else. And we'll talk about who that might be later. So in a sense, these firms can earn profit, but they can't be distributed to owners. And in fact, they don't even have owners, okay? So who these profits can be distributed to is kind of an interesting question. We'll look at that later. But for now, we're going to think about just the sort of hierarchy of a hospital. Okay, so it all starts with a board of trustees. So this is kind of like, you know, there's boards of trustees for normal businesses very frequently. Hospitals also have them. So this is a board of people, and they are empowered by a legal charter. Okay, so they have to obtain a legal charter to operate the hospital as a board of trustees. And the board is self-replicating. So the members of the board appoint new members, members to replace old members, that sort of thing. It's self-replicating. And they typically serve without pay, and they have no ownership in the stock of the hospital. And for whatever reason, on top of that, they're expected to donate to the hospital. And their responsibility is to choose who manages the hospital, and they also provide policy advice to the managers. The president is the most senior manager, so they oversee the entire operation of the hospital, and they are reported to by various vice presidents. So for example, you might have a VP of finance, right? Somebody that's, you know, maybe kind of like a CFO, a chief financial officer, you know, basically just overseeing the finances of the operation. There might be a VP of planning. So, you know, thinking about the future, right? Developing new buildings or new rooms or new units, right? Then there's a VP of nursing. So this person's in charge of all of the nurses in the hospital. There might be support services VP, so things like ambulances, the kitchen, those sorts of things, laundry, right? Support services, things that don't have any medical nature, but the things that the hospital needs to operate, right? Then there's VP of professional services. So this might be like radiology, physical therapy, et cetera. And there might be other subdivisions. It just depends on the hospital. These are just some examples, possible examples. And typically there are middle managers between the VPs and the lower levels of the organization. And activity is focused through subunits, which typically serve a particular type of patient. So there's typically like pediatrics. Typically there's like oncology, which has to do with cancer. And so there's typically subunits of the hospital that focus on in our particular type of patient. Each subunit typically has a head nurse. What's the name of the head nurse? I can't remember. Hold on. Charge nurse. So the head nurse is called a charge nurse. And each department or each subunit has its own supervisory charge nurse. And they direct all of the nursing activities in their unit. Okay, so there might be a charge nurse for the oncology department. and they would be in charge of supervising and directing the nursing activities in the oncology department. And typically each unit has somewhere between 20 and 40 beds. That's just on average. Could be more, could be less, depending on the hospital. And the units are typically described by their function, such as oncology or pediatrics. Or if it's a general function, like just general hospital rooms, then it might be described by its location. For example, floor 2 of the West Wing of the hospital, right? Right, ICU, the intensive care unit, that's a function. So we might describe the subunit as the ICU, or we might describe it by its location, perhaps the 2nd floor of the West Wing, right? So there's all of this activity and organization, right? But it omits the one person who actually initiates the activity, and that's the admitting doctor, right? The admitting doctor so far is not part of any of this structure, right? The doctor is actually not even typically an employee of the hospital and doesn't even have a boss higher up the line. They're kind of more or less independent from the hospital. And really, they only have a weak and ambiguous tie to the hospital, and that's in their role as what's called medical staff. And the medical staff itself has its own organizational structure and bylaws of operation. Did you have a question, Blythe? No? Okay. I just saw you put your finger up. I wasn't sure if you had a question. Okay, so this is completely separate from what we just saw, right? So the doctors that are responsible for admitting patients to the hospital, completely separate organizational structure. Now, they technically still do fall under the Board of Trustees, but they don't even have to report to the president or anybody else, which is crazy, right? And it's typically divided up according to specialty. So you might have a Department of Medicine, Department of Surgery, Pediatrics, et cetera. And in large hospitals, they might have further subdivisions, perhaps. And it's overseen by the Board of Trustees, but they actually don't really have much control over the doctors. And in fact, the board typically delegates the hiring decision to the existing medical staff. So there's typically like a committee of medical staff members that does the hiring of new members. Okay, so there's major differences that we should highlight between the medical staff and the employees within the management staff, which is sometimes called line management. So everybody else, right? The nurses, the financial people, the planners, right? That's the line management. Right, so the management staff, the line management, they have contracts directly with the hospital, and their performance is reviewed directly by the hospital and the supervisors of the hospital. They're paid by the hospital, and they can relatively easily be fired by the administrators. In comparison, the medical staff, the doctors who do the admitting, they do not receive income directly from the hospital. Furthermore, their performance is only very loosely reviewed. And with only a few exceptions, they basically cannot be fired. Once they are approved to be part of the medical staff, it's almost impossible to get rid of them. It's very difficult to remove that privilege. Okay, so this is still hospital organization. I don't know why the title's missing. Now that's kind of like the historical organization of hospitals, but things have been evolving more recently in the last several decades, right? So in the last several decades, and we've talked about this a little bit already, a lot of hospitals have begun purchasing physician practices and converting the physicians into salaried employees. So just to get an idea of these figures, and again, we've seen these figures before, but as of 2008, U.S. hospitals owned more than half of all physician practices. But it turns out that it owns smaller practices than the average size practice. So it turns out that they actually only hire or employ 40% of primary care doctors and 20% of specialists. So although they own more than half the practices, they don't employ more than half of salaried doctors. And again, it's because they typically buy smaller groups. Now, these doctors that they have in these owned practices essentially still have the same sort of medical staff appointments. They are still essentially independent, even though the hospital owns the group of which the physician is a part. And there's basically two things that are ensuring this independence. The first is that the ownership of the practice by the hospital does not mean that the hospital employs the doctor, right? The hospital owns the group, and it's the group that employs the doctor, which might seem like a very insignificant distinction, right? But nevertheless, this actually limits the hospital's control considerably. On top of that, there are a lot of states that have laws that limit the hospital's control over a physician's behavior. And the laws typically revolve around the prohibition of corporate practice of medicine. Okay, so the idea is that we don't want corporations practicing medicine because corporations are all about profit. And at least from a theoretical standpoint, that basically goes against the Hippocratic Oath, right? That's essentially the idea, right? So corporations cannot practice medicine and doctors cannot work for corporations, right? So lots of states have laws that prohibit this type of arrangement. Now, by law, most of the activities carried out in a hospital have to be at the doctor's orders. Okay, so the admitting physician has to give orders, which then directs the activities of the hospital, which is really bizarre because again, they're basically independent from the hospital. And the way that we can think about this is that the doctor's orders essentially create demand for hospital activities. And the hospital supplies those activities. So it's almost like the hospital itself, the interaction between this independent doctor and the hospital, it's almost like it's own self-contained market, right? The doctor and the doctor's orders create demand, and the supply comes from the hospital. The supply of those activities comes from the hospital. So in a sense, the doctor is the captain of the ship, so to speak. And despite being effectively independent, they're basically directing almost all of the activity and hence the use of resources within the hospital. Okay, so all of the different components of the line management, right? The nurses, the support staff, professional services like x-rays and radiology, all of their activities are being directed by the doctor and the doctor's orders. Now, of course, I don't know if a charge nurse gets some doctor's orders and is like, this isn't right. Of course, the charge nurse can go to their superior, the VP of nursing, and raise issue with the doctor's orders. Same thing with maybe the pharmacist or the x-ray technicians, right? They can go to their superiors and be like, the doctor is kind of, I'm not sure what they're thinking here. I'm not sure this is right. They can go to their superiors and raise issues. But nevertheless, the doctor is ultimately at the steering wheel, right? So really, a hospital is essentially two separate organizations. Um, one part of it is the medical staff that is creating the demand for hospital activity. And the other part of it is the line management, which is providing the supply of hospital activity. So really, we can think of a hospital as sort of like a one-stop job shop where every single product that it's providing is unique, and it's set up to provide the inputs required by medical staff who are essentially directing the output of the job shop. So that's kind of a nice way to think about it. Now, from the patient side of things, the patient is essentially agreeing to two different contracts, right? We have two different organizations within the hospital. So a patient that is admitted to the hospital is essentially agreeing to two separate contracts. They have one agreement with the hospital and another separate agreement with the doctor. The hospital contract basically says that the patient promises to pay the hospital for services, and in return, the hospital promises to provide medical care. Whereas in the contract with the doctor, the patient is still promising payment, right? That's really all the patient can do is promise to pay. And then in exchange, the physician promises care as well as direction of the hospital's activities in the provision of care. It's kind of interesting. Now, there's one very distinct disadvantage to this arrangement, and that's cost control. Cost control is very difficult, if not impossible, in this type of arrangement, right? And it's further exacerbated by the fact that the hospital is not operating as a for-profit organization, right? If it was, then cost control would be something that's incentivized, but here it's not. And in fact, the patient might be actually better equipped to monitor the doctor than the hospital itself, right? And also, the patient might actually be better off if the doctor and control of resources are independent from the hospital, right? And this issue related to the monitoring thing is the fact that the patient knows better about the doctor's success. They know, they're the patient, right? Did the doctor do a good job? Well, let me tell you, I don't feel so good, right? So no, or I feel great, so yes, right? So, all right, so that's the basic setup of the typical hospital, right? It's a not-for-profit organization. Admitting doctors who are part of the medical staff are essentially independent, even if the hospital owns the doctor's practice. And so we basically have two separate organizations within the hospital, sort of acting independently, and it makes cost control really difficult. So that's the setup. That's the organizational structure. So for next time, we will discuss this issue of who the residual claimant might be. And there's different possibilities. It can be the physicians, it could be the administrators, it could even be the patients. So that's kind of an interesting possibility. And each of those different possibilities comes with different consequences. And then we'll talk about something called the, what is it called? There's basically a model where the administrator has a utility function. And instead of maximizing profit, the administrator tries to maximize their own utility function. And the utility function involves not only their own compensation, but also particular goals of the hospital, like providing good care. And then tied to that is sort of a political consideration, right? The potential politics that might happen within a hospital. So there's actually a political theory model involved with that. Then we'll look at sort of, the supply side of things, thinking about the costs that the hospital faces, both in the short run and the long run, and thinking about how, what the hospital's cost curves look like. Then we'll look at a particular complication, and that's outpatient surgery as opposed to inpatient surgery. So surgery that takes place outside the hospital, sort of like a competition for the hospital in a sense. Then we'll look at this issue of individual demand facing a single hospital. And we will come back to this utility maximizing hospital manager issue, which is the second bullet point, right? That's the utility thing that I was talking about. So we will revisit that and think about some other things related to that issue. Okay, so that's for next time. I think we should be able to wrap this all up on Monday and hopefully get started on the next chapter. But at the very least, we should be able to wrap this up. And then we can start the next chapter on next Wednesday. But this is where we're at. I guess, first of all, are there any questions? Okay, no questions, good. So I went ahead and looked at our schedule and realized that we're a little behind. So I went ahead and revised the syllabus. So the schedule that's in the syllabus has been revised, it's been updated. So what I decided to do, let's see, maybe I can share it with you. Let me see if I can do that real quick here. Let me try to pull this up. Yeah, let me share this. Okay, cool. Share. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so we're a little bit behind. I ended up dropping some chapters, I guess chapter 13 and 14, which looked at malpractice and externalities. So it was a really tough decision to decide what to drop. Externalities and malpractice are really important aspects of the market for healthcare, but I felt like it was maybe the least important of these things. So while it is important, it's probably the least important. So here we are, March 31st. We just got started with chapter 8. I'm hoping that we can finish chapter 9 by next Wednesday. Okay, and then the other major change is that your exam got pushed back a week. Okay, so now your second exam is going to be scheduled for, or is going to be due next Saturday. Not this Saturday, but next Saturday. And it will, assuming that we get all the way through chapter 9 by next Wednesday, it will cover chapters 5 through 9. Okay, which I know I apologize, it doesn't give you a ton of time to study, but we're kind of short on time. So, you know, and we will have just covered chapter 9. So hopefully you won't have to review chapter 9 too much. You'll just go back and, you know, review chapters 5, 6, and 7, perhaps, maybe a little bit of 8, but, you know, and it shouldn't be too bad anyway, because it's basically open book, open notes, right? So while it is a short time span there from when we finish chapter 9 and the exam, you should be okay. It's open book, open note. So, and then from there, definitely wanted to cover chapter 10, 11, and 12, which all has to do with insurance. That's a really important part. I didn't want to cut any of that. And then I didn't want to cut regulation and public policy or international comparisons. If we have to cut more, I'll probably end up cutting chapter 15, because I really want to talk about the way that medicine is done in other parts of the world, because in most other industrialized nations, they have public health care, right? They have nationalized health care. So I really want to look at that. So I almost certainly will not drop chapter 16, but this is what we're looking at so far, hopefully for the rest of the semester. If we do have to drop anything else, it'll probably be chapter 15, but hopefully we can touch on that at least a little bit. But so this is the revised schedule. So yeah, any questions about that? Okay, cool. Oh, one last thing, homework for chapter 7. Homework for chapter 7. Let's do problems number 1, 3, and 4. Let's do 1, 3, and 4. All right, sound good? All right, cool. Well, y'all have a good weekend, and I'll see you Monday. Bye. Yes, Amen.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I just had a quick question. I know I said we'd have a meeting, but I know if you